Ladies and gentlemen, if I can start this evening's proceedings, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Wymondham College Chapel for the 5th annual Lincoln Lecture. I'm delighted for the second year running, the lecture is being presented in association with the Norwich and Norfolk branch of the English-Speaking Union, of which I have the honour to be president. And I'm pleased to welcome June and Brian Baker, the chairman and secretary of the branch, who are with us this evening. I'm also grateful to Mary Greer, Education Programmes Team Leader at the ESU headquarters in Dartmouth House, for travelling from London to represent the ESU at the lecture this evening. She and June and Brian will be only too pleased to speak to you afterwards about the ESU and its many and varied programmes, and there is an information table in the foyer of the chapel. The Lincoln Lecture was inaugurated 4 years ago as an apt way of celebrating both the history and the future of Wymondham College. 50 years previously, Secretary of State Dean Acheson had officially opened Lincoln Hall on the day of the college's very first speech day. In the September of 2008, the college had opened the splendid new Enid Ralph's building, adjacent to the original Lincoln Hall, to provide outstanding modern facilities for our sixth form boarders. And of course, February 2009 saw the bicentenary celebrations of the birth of Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, whose birth in Kentucky and adoption by Illinois does not prevent Norfolk from claiming him as one of our own. I'm still very pleased, quietly, that the only Lincoln bicentennial event officially recorded on the Library of Congress website was the inaugural Lincoln Lecture given by Professor Richard Carwardine in this chapel in February 2009. And I'm still very amused by the fact that when the listing was put up on the website, the location of the lecture was given as Wymondham College, Norfolk, Virginia. They subsequently corrected it, but it was fun to see it. The ties of blood and of culture that have spanned the Atlantic Ocean since even before the Lincoln family left Norfolk for the then American colonies are a source of constant fascination, and their study is profitable, not only for itself, but also for what it can reveal about ourselves, our view of the world, and our place in it. Secretary of State Acheson was famously dismissive of the concept of the special relationship. It was also he who delivered the oft-quoted put-down to Britain's post-colonial pretensions when he said of Great Britain that it had lost an empire but had yet to discover a role. I suspect that had the Secretary of State still been around to hear David Cameron's recent speech on Europe, he may well have concluded that his aphorism still held true. And yet we meet in this chapel because those ties of blood and of culture are of more than mere academic or political curiosity. 70 years ago this year, with liberty at peril across the world and tyranny in the ascendant, our college song reminds us, and I'm going to say this, not sing it, that the Pilgrim Fathers' sons returned and Wyndham's verdant acres turned to simple buildings, thus concerned to suffer bravely for this cause, the cause being the cause of freedom. And not just the Pilgrim Fathers' sons, as it happens, but their daughters too, and the sons and daughters of all those from all those countless other nations and peoples across the world drawn to find freedom in a new world. And the sons and daughters too of those who went to America not to find liberty, but who were taken there in slavery, only latterly to find emancipation and ultimately enfranchisement as a result of the war about which we will hear in our lecture tonight. Nor should we think those ties of blood and culture to be only of historical interest. As we meet here, the representatives of the United States Air Force, who were planning to be with us, are in fact on deployment, flying missions in support of the French Air Force and Royal Air Force mission in Mali. But tonight, we do allow ourselves the long view of all these things. And I'm delighted that Professor Martin Crawford has agreed to lead us in securing that long view. Professor Crawford is Emeritus Professor of Anglo-American History at the University of Keele. At Keele, he specialised in Southern and Civil War history. His current research is on the history of the Potters Joint Stock Emigration Scheme of the 1840s. An active member of the American Studies community for many years, he served as founding editor of the Journal of American 19th Century History. He is currently chair of branch, the British-American 19th Century Historians. Professor Crawford, thank you for being with us in Norfolk tonight, and I'm honoured to invite you to give the 2013 Lincoln Lecture.
Principal, thank you very much for that very gracious introduction. And thank you above all for inviting me to Wymondham, which I thought was in Virginia, but it seemed a long train journey. But to give this Lincoln lecture, I am greatly honored and privileged to be here. I want to thank you also for arranging such an interesting day today, the visit to Hingham, where I came into contact with the Lincoln family and Samuel Lincoln, beginning that dynasty, but especially the meetings with the students, many of whom I see here tonight. People often ask me what I miss most about full-time university teaching. It's easy to think of the things one doesn't miss. I suspect that the meetings of the Quality Standards Committee every Wednesday are probably high on that list. But I do miss the contact with young people. And so today's events were especially welcome. They were enjoyable, fun, rewarding, and I hope the students themselves got something from it. I certainly did. So thank you very much for that. And thank you all for being here this evening. It's a pleasure to see you all on such a cold evening. I hope what I have to say is of interest. I am an historian. I tell stories. That's what historians do. But I also hope to convey a story that challenges you a little bit. And at the end of it, I hope there may be one or two questions, criticisms. I've also become an old age pensioner, so money thrown at the lectern will be also very, very welcome. Now, first of all, let me say a brief word about my title, which is shamelessly borrowed from the field of American labor history. Which Side Are You On is the title of a song written in 1931 by Florence Reese. She was the wife of a Harlan County, Kentucky mine worker. The miners were then in bitter struggle with the mine owners. One of many such conflicts that occurred in the Appalachian region in the 19th and 20th centuries. The title has nothing to do directly with this evening's lecture, but I did think it appropriate because it conveys something of the passion with which both sides in the American conflict sought to persuade European opinion, European governments to the justice of their respective causes. Now, faced with such a distinguished audience, well-informed, I know, I struggled a little to think how I should begin this lecture. To give myself some confidence, I thought I would begin by talking about a subject on which I am a renowned authority. That topic is myself. Many years ago, I published a book called The Anglo-American Crisis of the Mid-19th Century, based upon the doctoral research that I did at Oxford. It was not a bestseller. The research focused upon the Times newspaper then at the zenith of its power as the organ of governing class opinion in Britain. By investigating its editorials, its news reports, its correspondence, I constructed a view of the relationship between Britain and America that placed a high value on the dynamics of mutual criticism across the Atlantic. The Anglo-American relationship had always functioned as something more than the interaction of economics, politics, culture, or diplomacy. Above all, it functioned through communication, through the ability of both nations and their constituent groups to sustain a friendly, if objective, dialogue through which the various interests could develop. In 1812, in the afterglow of the Revolution, the Anglo-American relationship had failed at a critical juncture, with the result that the two nations became embroiled in a costly and irresolute conflict. And periodically thereafter, tensions continued to arise between the two countries, and inevitably leading to talk of hostilities, even though in the end, war was averted. It's what the late Marcus Cunliffe, a great British historian of America, called the fascinated antagonism of the two societies that primarily interested me. Now, my research had concentrated on the years 1850 to 1862, but in a brief concluding section to my book, I ventured the opinion, and like all good opinions largely unsupported by evidence, that taking all factors into account, the prospect of Britain actively intervening on the side of the Confederate States in the American Civil War was a slim one. My argument, of course, was helped immensely by the fact that intervention did not take place. And I was then and continue to be now fully aware that had the Southern armies achieved decisive success on the battlefield, Anglo-American history might have taken a very different turn. Well, predictably, my little afterthoughts made very modest impact on the wider scholarship, and indeed during the late 1980s and 1990s, the subject of Anglo-American relations in the Civil War era fell out of fashion, interestingly, I think, part of a wider neglect of American foreign relations in the 19th century. American historians in particular seemed oddly uninterested in exploring the external connections and ramifications of their great internal conflict. But since the turn of the millennium, all that has changed, and transatlantic history, including most visibly the construction of the so-called Black Atlantic, has flourished. As a result, the study of British responses to the American War and of American responses to Britain, indeed of the war's overall international dimension, has achieved a new lease of life. Some of you may have seen or may have noticed Amanda Foreman's blockbuster, A World on Fire, in the bookshops. It is 1,000 pages long, so older members of the audience may wish to start reading it soon, if you get my drift. So, a few years ago, I found myself drawn back to a topic that I thought I had abandoned for good 2 decades previously. Now, this new scholarship, or recent scholarship, has pursued many different intellectual and empirical trails, but the best of it serves to remind us, above all, that the issues at stake in the American Civil War were far from parochial. For one thing, nations connected to the United States through commerce, kinship, or geography were bound to be affected by its great crisis. For another, the war between the Free State North and the slaveholding South embodied universal arguments of liberty, democracy, and nationalism that could not fail to resonate in other societies, even though such arguments were often misunderstood or their significance imperfectly grasped. In fact, in that very misunderstanding, that misapprehension, we may yet discover a rich interpretative vein. This revived interest resulted in some excellent and revealing scholarship, provoking fresh thinking especially about the thorny question of British non-intervention in the American War. The Southern secessionist cause generated considerable respect on this side of the Atlantic, yet the fact remains that Lord Palmerston's government failed to recognize the Confederate States, and Britain in general equally failed to provide sufficient material, political, or moral sustenance to help the slaveholders prolong their military effort. Modern research has uncovered a complex landscape of British sympathies for the contending parties, with some of the rebellion's strongest advocacy coming from those with a direct economic investment in the South, including many leading Lancashire textile manufacturers, and some of the weakest from working class and other reform organizations for whom the American War represented a test of democratic progress at home and abroad. Outnumbered and frequently outmaneuvered by their pro-Union rivals, the South's partisans worked assiduously to capitalize on the various popular and intellectual currents of discontent created or intensified by the war. These efforts all proved fruitless, however. In spite of the range of support it attracted, the Confederacy, in the words of the historian Richard Blackett, was singularly unsuccessful in stamping its view of the war on the British public. Why did the South fail to attract sufficient support to effect a change in policy? That question is, I think, a crucial one. In answering it, historians have traditionally focused on British political and economic interests and the belief that intervention on the Confederacy's side would not achieve the desired goals of preserving the cotton supply, and most likely will also embroil this country in a potentially disastrous war with a newly militarized federal union. Convinced that the North could not prevail and that a negotiated outcome was thus inevitable, Britain was content to follow a wait-and-see approach. Muddying the waters of argument was the issue of slavery, the root cause of the war. Mainstream British opinion was naturally hostile to the South's labour system, but remained sceptical of the Union's anti-slavery commitment, a position ostensibly validated by Abraham Lincoln's repeated public insistence, and I stress that word public, repeated public insistence that he was not fighting an abolition war. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, Lincoln memorably replied to Horace Greeley in August 1862, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union, and what I forbear because I do not believe it would help save the Union. When, a month later, the President set the wheels of emancipation in motion, many across the Atlantic were convinced that his action, born more, they concluded, of necessity rather than conviction, would result not in the sweet taste of freedom, but in bitter, servile insurrection, or as they often put it, race war. Now, the widely predicted slave revolt did not occur, although the majority in Britain continued to believe that the American war must end in some form of negotiated settlement. Lincoln's Emancipation Decree heralded a permanent change in perceptions of the war's character, and after 1863 it was increasingly difficult to envisage any British government actively intervening in support of the slaveholders' cause. With the military conflict across the Atlantic seemingly stalemated, European affairs, beginning with the rebellion in Poland, quickly reasserted their prime claim to attention. Exactly when this intervention crisis came to a head is still open to debate. Yet the precise timing of Britain's rejection of intervention is less significant than either the fact or the nature of the rejection itself. While it is true that all offers to mediate in the war had invited instant and angry denunciation from the federal government, which refused to countenance any scheme, however motivated, that conferred legitimacy on the slaveholders' rebellion, the British government, as Howard Jones notes, never considered intervention on behalf of the South, but saw it rather as an act of remonstrance against a conflict which most in Britain continued to believe could not be resolved on the battlefield. But Southerners had seemingly wanted and expected more. Nothing better embodies the failure of the South's ill-prepared bid for independence than the disparity between the slaveholders' expectations of British support and the support they ultimately received from this side of the Atlantic. So much of the focus of this period has been on how close Britain came to intervening in the American war. Too little notice has been taken of the slaveholders' anger when intervention did not materialize, or indeed of how little they gained from such incidents as the Trent crisis in late 1861, when Britain and the United States seemed close to diplomatic rupture, and even in some discussions, actual conflict. In the final accounting, the South's frustration at the failure of Britain and other European powers to recognize its national independence bred a deep resentment that resulted, among other actions, in the expulsion in 1863 of all British consuls from the Confederacy. The English have taken merely a spoiling interest in the American conflict, observed the South's leading propagandist in Europe in August of that year, and have not waken up to the universal issues of moral right, national liberty, humanity, and civilization involved. Of course, phrases that could easily have come from the lips of northern leaders such as Abraham Lincoln. Universal issues of moral right, national liberty, humanity, and civilization. Both sides, on that view, fighting for the same thing. Well, as we know in our own relationships, expectations of how we should behave toward each other invariably govern our reactions to actual behavior. So what I'd like to do now is briefly to examine the expectations that each side in the American conflict held about British support in 1861. Let's begin with Lincoln's North. Of course, the first point to make is that the North did not see itself as the North at all, but as the United States of America, the lawfully constituted union whose very existence was now threatened by rebellious criminal Southerners. On the 4th of March 1861, a few minutes after taking the oath of presidential office, Abraham Lincoln described secession as anarchy and the secessionists themselves as unreasoned destroyers of legitimate authority. So legitimacy is the first and arguably the most powerful argument presented by Northerners in their bid to attract European and specifically British support. In the view of Lincoln and other federal leaders, secession was an illegal act for foreign countries to acknowledge the Confederate States or to give support to Southern rebels in any guise would be to support illegality. And surely Britain, above all nations with an overseas empire that covered 9.5 million square miles and included nearly 150 million subjects, could ill afford such a course of action. Britain and other nations had an inescapable duty, the North's argument ran, to support the sovereign nation, the United States of America, in its hour of crisis. Northern leaders conceded that international law permitted the recognition of de facto government, but they emphatically denied that one existed in the South and were bitterly aggrieved when on the 13th of May 1861, Queen Victoria issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, granting belligerent status to the Confederacy, to be followed in June by similar action from France. There is here, as there always has been, one political power, namely the United States of America, competent to make war and peace and conduct commerce and alliances with all foreign nations. The new Secretary of State, William H. Seward, pointedly reminded the London and Paris governments. But if there were to be any doubt about British duty, the surely questions of morality would settle the argument once and for all. And here, naturally, Northerners were talking about African American slavery. Britain itself had abolished slavery in its possessions in 1833, endowing the nation with a moral prestige which was reinforced by its subsequent actions against the transatlantic slave trade in the 1840s and 1850s. It is true that the organized abolition movement had declined in numbers and prestige since the heady days of the 1830s. But in 1852, the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin had confirmed an extraordinary reservoir of anti-slavery feeling in Britain. Harriet Beecher Stowe's sentimental narrative, which Lord Palmerston claimed to have read 3 times, sold more than 1 million copies within 8 months of its appearance and led directly to the Stafford House Address, in which more than 500,000 signatures added further testimony of the deep concern the slavery issue aroused in mid-Victorian Britain. And so with the federal government now in the hands of Republicans, yes, the same party that we have now, the party founded in 1854 to promote free soil expansion, expectations were rife in Britain that Britain would live up to its anti-slavery credentials and support the federal union in its struggle against the southern slaveocracy, a favorite northern word. Where are now the apostles of freedom and free labor in England who are constantly having their fling at us Republicans for our supineness in pressing the anti-slavery cause, demanded the New York journalist and diplomat John Bigelow in September 1861. And finally, if considerations of legitimate duty and anti-slavery morality were not enough, there remained the question of American power. Throughout the pre-Civil War period, Britain and the US had confronted one another in a number of areas, and as each crisis passed or was resolved, it became apparent how far Britain had come to accept the realities of American power. Acceptance was especially evident in relation to the US's political and strategic authority in the Western Hemisphere, where declining British opposition to American expansion was very striking. In 1854, the Canadian Reciprocity Treaty further helped Britain to come to terms with American power. And in general, by that decade, we see a significant acceptance that whatever its social, economic, and political frailties, America was here to stay. Coincidentally, the population of the United States overtook that of Great Britain during the 1850s, a clear sign to opinion makers on both sides of the Atlantic of America's tremendous latent resources. Most thinking people in Britain were impressed with the explosive continental growth of the United States, even as they often feared its ramifications. And few were unaware that it was a power that could be marshaled quickly and, if need be, directed against British interests, especially on the long, virtually unguarded border with Canada. Having only recently emerged from the Crimean debacle, Northern Americans asked, did the British seriously wish to embroil themselves in another foolish foreign adventure in which they were bound to suffer humiliation and loss? So federal leaders, notably the Secretary of State Seward, made it abundantly clear that any intervention on the South side would likely result in an Anglo-American war. What of the South? As Southerners viewed the situation, the Confederate States had an even greater claim to foreign support on the basis of its legitimacy. Secession, its advocates insisted, had been a legal act involving a assumption of original state sovereignty prior to organization into a new confederation. In his founding speeches, the new president, Jefferson Davis, went out of his way to insist that the Confederacy did not derive from a revolutionary opposition to established authority, but was in fact a counter-revolution. I think I might add, if I were looking at this again now, a conservative counter-revolution, forced on Southerners by the tyrannical conflict of an abolitionized North. Secession thus fully met American constitutional tests. Quote, the right solemnly proclaimed at the birth of the United States, and which has been solemnly affirmed and reaffirmed in the Bill of Rights of the states subsequently admitted into the Union of 1789, undeniably recognizes in the people the power to resume the authority designated for the purposes of government. Thus, the sovereign states here represented have proceeded to form this confederacy. Southerners, therefore, believed they were fully justified in demanding that foreign nations acknowledge, support, and crucially recognize the Confederate States as a legitimately constituted nation. Moreover, Southerners thought themselves a distinct people, not only legally entitled to independence, but also culturally required to do so. After all, had not Britain supported self-determination in Europe and in Latin America, why would it hesitate to do so now? It is hard to judge whether Southerners believed such arguments would prove decisive in the corridors of power on this side of the Atlantic. On the other hand, they seem to have entertained no doubts about expecting support on economic grounds. From the outset, Southerners played the free trade card, a predictable gambit given the Cotton States' history of passionate, ideologically charged opposition to federal import tariffs, but one also very much in tune with the times. Here they were helped by the short-sighted actions of Republicans, who in one of their first acts after gaining control of Congress following the departure of Southern colleagues, passed a highly protectionist Merrill tariff bill. It was a move that deeply offended many in Britain, including supporters of the United States, such as John Bright, who described the legislation as stupid and unpatriotic. Southerners were naturally delighted. The Merrill tariff has operated wonderfully in our favor and seems almost designed by Providence for our support, observed one. But dwarfing free trade in Southern economic calculation was cotton. Cotton was king in the South, in Senator James Hammond's celebrated phrase. Southerners now demanded that it was also king in Europe, and that its reign would uniquely determine the direction of British and indeed French support. Southern cotton undeniably dominated Anglo-American trade with the US, comprising in the late 1850s anything between 60 and 82% of the total value of American imports into Britain. An estimated 20% of the British population earned its livelihood or directly or indirectly from the manufacture of cotton products. Without American cotton, the South believed that British looms would stand idle, with the resulting unemployment eventually inducing social revolution. But Southerners also believed that before such a crisis was reached, the British government would intervene in American affairs to secure cotton and prevent national catastrophe. It is hard to overestimate the extent to which Southerners believed that cotton could fix everything. As a writer in DeBow's Review, the leading Southern commercial periodical, put it in 1859, in cotton the South possesses a weapon more formidable than all the inventions of modern warfare. England will ever be held in check by this model king, for she dare not risk revolution at home by depriving millions of the people of their support. Touring the southern states in early 1861, the special correspondent of the Times, the irrepressible William Howard Russell, was constantly bombarded with the same theme. They believe in the irresistible power of cotton and in the natural alliance between manufacturing England and France and the cotton-producing states, he reported from Montgomery. Although Russell was first to acknowledge that an interruption in the cotton supply would produce serious economic distress across the Atlantic, he was very irritated by the assumption repeatedly expressed to him that economics alone would determine British policy towards the South. Confidence in King Cotton even spilled over to those who represented areas not dependent upon the staple. Addressing the US Senate in February 1861, the Western North Carolina fire eater Thomas Clingman boasted, this is before the Senate, Alexander claimed to have conquered the world, but his dominions were confined to Asia and the territories on the shore of the Bosphorus. Julius Caesar, a still mightier monarch, ruled only on the eastern continent. King Cotton governs 2 hemispheres and dominates on land and sea, and the kings of the east and the merchant princes of the west obey his bidding. So here we have it, as the Confederate leadership understood it, by securing its sovereign territory, by organizing an effective central government capable of carrying out its commitments, and by entering the international community as a viable commercial participant capable of defending its interests. The South believed it met the requirements for international recognition. But above all, Britain and other European nations would have little choice but to recognize and actively intervene to support the independence of the Confederate States, for if they did not, they would soon be brought to their knees by the inexorable power of King Cotton. Now, if we look critically at the rival expectations of North and South at the beginning of the Civil War, we can see that each had evident flaws. Few could deny that the United States was the legitimate nation, but few could accept the North's belief in union at all costs. As the human and material price of Lincoln's attempt to subdue the South became evident, many in Britain, perhaps a majority, came to question the core assumption upon which the policy of coercion was based. Northerners were, after all, expecting foreign nations to have the same belief in the Union that they did. Do not idolize your Union, the Duchess of Argyll told Senator Charles Sumner in 1863, reflecting the difficulties that even sympathetic observers had with a concept that in Lincoln's skilled hands had come to exert extraordinary ideological and moral authority among ordinary people in the North. As to any threatened deployment of federal power, that was bound to generate fierce opposition in Britain, who had long experience of the blustering behavior of successive generations of American democratic politicians. Passing through London in May 1861, Lincoln's newly appointed minister to St. Petersburg, the Kentucky slaveholder turned abolitionist Cassius Marcellus Clay, issued a bombastic warning to those on this side of the Atlantic who opposed the federal government's policy. Quote, "England is our natural ally. Will she ignore our aspirations? If she is just, she ought not. If she is honorable and magnanimous, she cannot. If she is wise, she will not." That last heavily emphasized in italics in the press. Clay's tactless intervention enraged British opinion, alienating many natural sympathizers and confirming for many the difficulties in dealing with such an unpredictable and often incorrigible ally. The North's anti-slavery credentials were equally contentious. During the first half of the war, as I've already described, Abraham Lincoln and the federal leadership were adamant that this was not a war to eliminate black slavery, but a war to preserve the Union. The latter aim, of course, remained paramount even after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Throughout 1861, the statements and actions of the Washington government continually belied the attempts of Republican propagandists abroad to present the American conflict as an anti-slavery crusade. These gentlemen have one language for their own country and one for Europe, complained the Times in November. Whether British attitudes towards the conflict would have been radically different had Lincoln's government made abolition an early war aim is something that cannot be answered. But there can be little doubt that the moral appeal in Europe of the Union's determination to force the South back into the Union was severely weakened by abolition's absence. When we turn to the South's expectations, however, we see a different kind of failure. Self-determination was arguably the idea that ought to have struck a chord across the Atlantic had it been pursued vigorously and intelligently. Unfortunately, Southern leaders chose to place far too great a reliance on another idea. In fact, an idea, as the late Peter Parrish noted many years ago, that masqueraded as a policy, King Cotton. Plausible in theory, King Cotton was deeply flawed in fact and implementation. Cotton stocks in Britain and France had never been higher. The Southern planters were victims of their own success, with the 1859 crop in particular especially bountiful. Warehouses in Liverpool and Manchester were overflowing with the white stuff, and many Lancashire textile manufacturers were actually glad of the breathing space, which allowed them to reorganize their industry and reduce costs. Moreover, Southerners did not have a monopoly of supply, And throughout the antebellum period, Britain had taken steps, albeit inadequate ones, to develop and protect other supply sources, notably in India. This is not to diminish the importance of American cotton, superior in quantity and particularly quality to that of its international competitors. And by the autumn of 1862, the loss of the cotton supply was beginning to have serious economic and social consequences in British mill communities. But King Cotton diplomacy crucially failed because of the way that Southerners implemented it. In effect, the policy amounted to economic blackmail. Unless you recognize us, we will deprive you of this essential item. Here, the issue of the federal blockade becomes relevant. Southern diplomats were required to protest that Lincoln's blockade of the southern coastline was ineffective, a so-called paper blockade, and thus illegal under international law. But in order for that argument to be accepted, Southerners had to explain why, if the blockade was so ineffective, so porous, cotton was not getting through. The answers given usually referred to the limited size and availability of the Confederate merchant marine, but the real reason was that Southern planter leaders had imposed a quasi-legal embargo on cotton's export in an attempt to put pressure on Britain and France. Subsequently, cotton was used in a more constructive way as an instrument of foreign negotiation, but in the crucial first 2 years of the war, when Confederate military success was still possible, the attempt to force European compliance was bound to fail. In mid-Victorian Britain, statesmen like Palmerston and Lord John Russell were unlikely to respond favourably to such blatant economic arm-twisting. Now, many other aspects of Confederate foreign relations contributed to the failure to achieve international recognition, including perhaps the choice of its representatives abroad. But this over-reliance on cotton for economic leverage was surely the most serious. Tactics aside, King Cotton diplomacy failed to recognize that although the staple was an important component of the Atlantic economy, it was by no means the only one. In the 1850s, the diplomatic rapprochement between Britain and America was underwritten by maturing commercial and financial interdependence across a wide landscape of activity. Overseas trade largely sustained the British industrial economy at this time, with well over 20% of total exports being dispatched to the US by mid-decade, with the computed value of American imports into Britain in excess of twice that of its nearest competitor. Yes, cotton dominated the trade between the two countries. But, for example, the role of American farmers in feeding Britain's burgeoning population should not be underestimated. After 1846, the United States became the major foreign provider of grain and flour, and generally between 1854 and 1861, well over half of British imports, and in some commodities over 3/4 of essentials such as bacon, beef, lard and pork came from that source. And needless to say, these items overwhelmingly originated in the free states north of the Ohio River. One school of thought long ago even went so far as to propose King Wheat as more fitting than King Cotton in explaining the outcome of British responses to the Civil War. Add to that the extent and complexities of the British export trade, the vital contribution of capital and technology flows, and we have an Anglo-American economy far removed from the South's naive model. Comparative statistics play down the local impact of specialized interdependence. Take my own area, the North Staffordshire potteries. In every year during the 1850s, the US was the main market for Staffordshire earthenware products, accepting generally between 40 and 50% of the area's total exports. The relative insignificance of that trade in aggregate figures, exceeding £600,000 to the US in only 3 years, belies its tremendous importance to the economy and livelihoods of the potteries. And these local considerations become vitally important when we consider their political impact. For every area like Lancashire, where pressure to recognize the South's independence might have developed, there were others. Birmingham, with its arms manufacturing, is a prime example where a different scenario may have prevailed. And arguably far more influential than either in dictating British responses to the war were Anglo-American bankers such as the Barings, the Rothschilds, and the Peabodys, whose investment in the emergent capitalist order of the northeastern United States generally predisposed them to favor a Union victory. Recent Southern scholarship has sought to validate the region's internationalist credentials, but in my view, In their excessive faith in cotton, the South's planter leaders revealed the deficiencies in their internationalist outlook. Most explanations for the British failure to intervene on the Confederacy's side downplay the extent to which the slave South, which in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the era of Thomas Jefferson, had been a conspicuous presence in the transatlantic community, had become alienated from the main landscape of Anglo-American commerce, culture, and belief. We know how much Southern cotton was sent to these shores. We know far less about how many Southerners were active participants in the transatlantic networks upon which the cotton trade relied. How many influential Southerners visited Britain, for example, or were in regular communication with leading economic, political, or intellectual figures on this side of the Atlantic? Among leading Southern political figures, the list of those with direct experience of Europe is decidedly thin, although admittedly 2 of the 3 occupants of the Confederate State Department did cross the Atlantic prior to secession. Robert Toombs, the first and undeniably worst Southern Secretary of State, came to London and Paris on a shopping and sightseeing visit in 1855. The transatlantic visits of his far more able successor, Judah P. Benjamin, were dictated by his need to see his estranged wife and daughter in Paris. Now, direct experience of Europe was also limited among much of the federal leadership, Lincoln most obviously included. Yet in Massachusetts, Senator Charles Sumner, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and his former colleague in the upper house, William H. Seward, the Secretary of State, the Union possessed 2 men whose internationalism arguably exceeded anything the South could muster. And this despite the fact that both men were capable of anti-British rabble-rousing whenever the fancy took them, which was often. Sumner's relationship with leading British liberals is well known. Less accepted is Seward's transatlantic engagement. Although the wily New Yorker delighted in tweaking John Bull's tale, and in early 1861 even suggested to the Duke of Newcastle, who was visiting with the Prince of Wales, suggested provoking a foreign war as a means of deflecting secession, he was by any yardstick an Anglophile. Seward had made 2 extended visits across the Atlantic by the time he assumed office, kept in touch with British friends via correspondence, and was a strong advocate of the Atlantic Telegraph, which he saw as vitally important to fostering Anglo-American friendship. Now, there were Southerners, such as the influential New Orleans editor, James Dubois, who advocated stronger links with Europe. And at various commercial conventions throughout the 1840s and 50s, there was a lot of huffing and puffing about the need for direct steamship routes to help circumvent the North's commercial dominance. But nothing came of it. And as the dogs of secession yelped ever louder, the poverty of the slave South's internationalism was strikingly revealed. Independence, not interdependence, was the planters' unceasing cry. And so by neglecting the main transatlantic networks, Southerners ensured that independence effectively meant a degree of isolation from the dynamic developments that were transforming the Atlantic world. Despite the powerful thread of cotton linking Britain and the South, a glance through any mid-19th century British newspaper will confirm how underrepresented the slave states were in the Anglo-American information system, with editors overwhelmingly relying on Northern copy for their American news. This information failure reflected Southern development, or the character of Southern society at large. Throughout the 19th century, Southern development lagged behind that of every other part of the United States. With 1/3 of the population in 1860, Southerners could muster up only 10% of the nation's manufacturing labor force, only 11% of its manufacturing capital, trailing not only New England and the mid-Atlantic states, as you would expect, but also the Midwest, which had started much later. Quantitatively deficient, the South was also qualitatively at odds with the vigorous entrepreneurial culture of the mid-Atlantic area, where the dynamic mesh of information, capital, and technology was producing startling results. Leveraging their transatlantic contacts and networks with resources of their own, writes the historian Peter Koklanis, merchants and manufacturers in the Northeast were able by the 1850s to establish the foundations economic, social, political, institutional, and cultural of a modern urban industrial society. Now, at the core of the South's isolation was inevitably slavery. During the 1840s and 50s, the slave South had erected a cultural and intellectual wall around itself to prevent infection from Free State ideas, to immunize itself from the contagion of Northern liberalism. But in so doing, they simultaneously created a barrier between themselves and Europe. And not surprisingly, isolation bred suspicion and hostility to anything and everything that seemed to challenge the values of the slave society. Fear of abolition, for example, strongly shaped Southern attitudes towards Europe's revolutionary upheavals. And nowhere is this anxiety over the security of the slave society better revealed than in the rampant Anglophobia embraced by so many Southerners in the 2 decades before the Civil War. Those same Southerners, we must remind ourselves, who in 1861 now insisted that Britain support them in their independence struggle. Now, anti-British sentiment was widespread in pre-Civil War America. Not surprising, given the nation's revolutionary origins. No class or section was immune from it, but it was in the slave South that hostility to Britain raged most consistently and fiercely. To the general fears that Britain continued to seek, if not the destruction, at least the curtailment of the American democratic experiment, Southerners added the extra ingredient of abolitionism. During the mid-40s in particular, Southern politics became infected with virulent Anglophobic rhetoric as slaveholding leaders raised the spectre of British designs on the then independent Republic of Texas. Leading the charge was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the preeminent political and intellectual defender of slave society. Now, in the event, Southerners defeated the dastardly British plot, which didn't exist, by the simple expedient of annexing Texas to the US in 1845, thus expanding their own slaveholding domain, which is what the whole issue had been about in the first place. Calhoun himself died in 1850, but he cast a long shadow, and as the sectional crisis reached its climax at the end of the decade, it is hardly a shock to see Anglophobia again rearing its head. In speeches, pamphlets, and letters, Britain was demonized as the mother of abolitionism, in the words of one Georgia newspaper. The difference now was that Southerners needed to combine anti-British tirades with an explanation of why those same wicked British, should support them in their fight for nationhood. Now, Southern views, as you can gather from that, of Britain and the British were often caught between fantasy and reality. Members of the South's governing class often liked to imagine an identity of interest between themselves and the English gentry, claiming descent from cavalier society, and professed to be repelled by industrialization and the miseries experienced, for example, by Lancashire mill workers. Yet the whole theory of King Cotton required the continued expansion of British industry. If demand for cotton slackened, the South's economy, and with it the social, political, and racial authority of slaveholders, would be eroded. Of course, what offended Calhoun and other planter spokesmen was not British commercial policy, nor any real fear that the British were about to reduce mankind, Americans included, to economic vassalage, but Britain's emergence as a leading anti-slavery power. So by the beginning of the 1860s, as the Cotton States finally made good their threat to leave the Union, we see Southerners sharpening their view of Britain as a nation and people whose only impulses were selfish, even malign. It was hardly a recipe for transatlantic mutuality. In their official discourse, the Confederacy's leaders spoke the language of shared interest, but scratched beneath the surface a little, and you'll find a more uninhibited expression of slaveholding resentment towards monarchical Britain, and to a lesser extent France, often coupled with a deep and surprising disdain for international interdependence. Let us beware then of foreign friends, the future Confederate Congressman William Smith told the Alabama Secession Convention. England has no feelings in common with us. Her politicians are emancipationists. In the view of many in the South, on the eve of the Civil War, Britain represented everything antithetical to the values and institutions of a free, democratic, and slave society. Arguably, recognition becomes an end in itself, a form of validation, with too little attention being paid to forging bilateral alliances through which much-needed practical assistance could be gained. And there's no better representative to point up that failure than the head man himself, President Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, a state, by the way, best known in Britain, in British financial circles in particular, for having repudiated its state debt repayments in the late 1840s. Davis was a paradoxical figure, an arch-expansionist who yet appears to have had only limited interest or understanding in foreign affairs. Even his most sympathetic biographer admits that the South's elected leader had a provincial view of the world, and that he, quote, simply couldn't understand why European nations consulted their own national interests in dealing with the recently emerged Confederate States of America. And so it seems to me that, for all its belief in the global power of cotton, the South was ill-prepared for the challenge of joining the North Atlantic community of nations, of which Britain was undoubtedly the most significant member. Despite the sympathy that the Confederate underdog cause undoubtedly inspired in Britain, only a small minority of people in this country consciously approved of the South, its society, or its political ambitions. And at the root of this disapproval was slavery, the fatal flaw in the South's makeup. The anti-slavery sentiment is universal, reported the Confederate envoy, William Yancey from London, in July 1861. Uncle Tom's Cabin has been read and believed. Well, finally, I think it would be a mistake to see this disjunction in narrow moralistic terms. Let me add one extra little ingredient to my argument that the slave South was at odds with the world from which, in 1861, it now demanded support. This final reflection is prompted both by my current research into the history of emigration from North Staffordshire and by this evening's occasion, which arguably would not be taking place at all had the 15-year-old Samuel Lincoln chose not to leave Norfolk for Massachusetts in 1637. Nothing more points up the South's alienation from modernity than its failure to participate in the mass migrations that were transforming the rest of the United States in the 19th century. The 20 years leading up to the Civil War saw the first wave of mass migration across the Atlantic, and they reveal an overwhelming preference for free state over slave state settlement. According to the federal census of 1850, the first to record, by the way, an individual's country of birth, only 7% of the country's nearly 300,000 English-born inhabitants lived in the South. Not only were the southern states attracting only a small minority of English emigrants, but the gap between the slave and free states was widening in the decade before the Civil War, as the South was rapidly overtaken by the new states to the west. If I were a young man, I would sever myself from the old world and plant myself in the western region of the United States, concluded Richard Cobden in 1859. And clearly, thousands were heeding his advice. Actually, it was not only the British who were avoiding the South. Foreign immigration as a whole was severely limited in the 11 states that would make up the Confederacy, with only Louisiana and Texas registering significant percentages. Contrast that with the free states of the Northeast and West, where a rapidly changing ethnic landscape provided much of the impetus for economic and social development. In short, the white South, so confident in its future, was demographically stagnating, at least in terms of the element that had historically played such a vital role in American expansion and renewal, foreign immigration. This relative lack of ethnic diversity, resulting from the failure to attract foreign immigrants, arguably reinforced the South's parochialism, its political, intellectual, and racial conservatism. Yet ironically, that is not the way that Southerners themselves viewed it. Countless Southerners celebrated that the region had escaped the effects of mongrelization, a horrible but much used word, brought on by foreign influx. Effects they claimed that were in part responsible for the Free States' decline into corruption and tyranny. In his inaugural address, delivered at Montgomery in February 1861, President Davis waxed lyrically about the homogeneity of the South, ironic again in the uniquely biracial society he had been elected to lead. Well, the failure of the slave states to attract British and other European immigrants had consequences which go well beyond the scope of this discussion. But in my view, it offers a final verification of the South's estrangement from an Atlantic community into which it now demanded entry as a sovereign, independent nation. By 1861, economic and political momentum in the North Atlantic belonged not to Old South agrarianism, and even less to the immoral and anachronistic institution of African-American slavery that sustained it, but to its antithesis, the vibrant, interdependent, free labor society of the North and West. It was to these communities that thousands of ordinary men and women from Norfolk, North Staffordshire, and countless other places came, voting, you may say, with their feet. Anglo-American relations in the Civil War era would be dictated by interest, not sentiment. And as I read it, the power of cotton, the lure of free trade, and the mythical cavalier spirit notwithstanding, the social, economic, and political interests that bound Britain to the south in 1861 were almost certainly weaker than those to its rapidly industrializing rival to the north. In the end, nothing the rebel slaveholders could offer, apart from the fait accompli of military victory, was able to divert the British from their traditional concerns, least of all along a road that might precipitate a revival of war between the two countries. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. First question.
The Quakers were very influential in changing Britain at the beginning of the 19th century, certainly by their financial power. But didn't they also reset Britain's moral compass to some extent?
I'm sure they did. And indeed, when you look at this thorny question of who supported whom in the Civil War, you find that if you drew a religious map of support, you'd find broadly the established church tending towards the conservative side and tending to be more sympathetic to the Southerners' cause. On the other side, you find nonconformists and Quakers. And so I think Quakers and other groups, I think, were important in shaping that. And of course, they've been influential from way back in the anti-slavery crusade and continued to provide a moral voice in these arguments. In the end, I don't know, who do governments listen to? They listen to their own voices first and foremost, particularly in the 19th century. They take account of public opinion. But public opinion in the 19th century is a very tricky thing for governments to establish and to discern. Had the various groups gone onto the streets and rioting, had the mill workers reached Whitehall and burnt down some of the buildings there, maybe that sort of opinion on the streets would have an effect. Quakers and others were providing a great deal of correspondence to the government, saying, please follow your anti-slavery heart. In the end, British national interests will be determined by a rather small group of men in Westminster and Whitehall. But certainly they play a very important part in establishing the moral constants of Britain throughout the 19th century. Absolutely so, yes. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, you said,
where are we?
Near the beginning, you said something about Britain declared belligerent status or something in international law. Can you explain that a bit more?
This is why I need my lawyer's hat, if I had one. In early 1861, Britain felt it had to take some legal note of the American war. It had to do that because there were a variety of issues bubbling up that, if not settled legally, were bound to drag Britain into disputes and trouble with both sides across the Atlantic. Most obviously, there was the issue of shipping and what was the status of the various southern and northern fleets that were patrolling the Atlantic. How would they deal with these matters when British commercial vessels became embroiled in that? So you had to have some legal status. Also, the question of recruitment was important. During the Crimean War, Britain and America had become involved in all sorts of complicated difficulties about the recruitment / seizure of British nationals into the American armies. So it was a question of regularizing the law to allow normal activity to continue. Both Britain and France issued a proclamation of neutrality. That gave certain rights to the South. Quite limited rights, but it did grant them what was called belligerency status, acknowledging the fact that they are an entity, they are fighting, And at certain points, that fighting will produce a legal argument that therefore needs to be refined. The trouble with that, of course, was that overwhelmingly in the North, the Proclamation of Neutrality, which was actually seen here as a rather modest measure, was interpreted as step one on the road to full recognition of the Confederate nation. Southerners, of course, were delighted by being given certain belligerent rights to dock at European ports, for example. But they themselves, of course, interpreted this as leading inevitably to recognition. So it was seen here as quite a modest measure, a natural bringing of the law in line with the reality of the conflict, but interpreted very different by both sides in the conflict, in the war. Yes, final question.
To what extent, if at all, do you regard the neoconservatives of present America as heirs to the Confederacy?
Gosh, that's a global question of. Some neoconservatives, certainly, I would call them neo-Confederates. I think we were talking earlier with some of the students about the difficulties of research via the internet. You know, the internet is a wonderful resource, but it must be approached with some caution. And when one looks at some of the neo-Confederate websites that appear, all very wonderfully designed and very plausible with footnotes and scholarly references and references from certain accomplished people, one is tempted to believe this is, in a sense, mainstream opinion. And some of them are very nasty indeed. And some of them offer a view of race in America that most correct-thinking people, right, left, centre, will have nothing to do with. Now, the broader neo-conservative agenda, it's more obviously a new invention, I think, or a more recent invention, in that it takes hostility to government to a level that we had not seen, I think, previously. Confederates were not hostile to government, and the irony of the Confederacy was, as soon as they got into power, of course, they started building strong national governmental institutions, and Davis got into terrible difficulty over that. They found they needed an army, they found they needed a bureaucracy, they needed to tax people, else the army isn't going to get paid and isn't going to fight. So I think there is some image there. But I think more broadly, the new right, it's a kind of belated reaction to New Deal liberalism, I think, of the 30s and 40s. But I wouldn't discount the Southern neo-Confederate strain in that. It's there somewhere, but its nastier versions are even repudiated by some of the new right.
It is an honour to follow such an engaging speaker as Professor Crawford, who immediately put me at comfort when he said that he too struggled with starting his speech. Having applied to do history myself at university, I now realise how much I have to learn to become nearly as successful as you have. There comes a point in all of our lives when a choice has to be made. Whilst Professor Crawford made it clear that Great Britain would not and did not intervene, one cannot help but imagine what the state of things would be now, or certainly immediately after the Civil War had ended, had Great Britain decided to have an intervention. Does a country like Great Britain base any significant decision on moral values, siding with the Quakers and going with public opinion, or instead do they go with economic factors, such as the perceived economic stress after 1862? These problems are just as relevant today facing the modern politicians as they were back then, and it's something that I find incredibly fascinating to be able to compare. America today, opinion is still heavily split, not over topics such as slavery, but instead abortion, gun laws, gay marriage. The passion Americans bring to the conviction of their opinions, something I have failed, as a politics student also, to notice to the same extent in the UK, is both fascinating and infectious. This demonstrates, as we were talking about earlier, that whilst America is a constantly changing country, adapting because of its base on immigration and what that has brought the country, that there are many citizens that still hold on to core values. Are these the values that they've interpreted from the Constitution? Who knows? We are defined as humans by the choices that we make. And out of all this day has given me, it is the awareness of the consequences that our choices could potentially lead to. And this is what I will take with me the most. On behalf of Wymondham College and Lincoln Hall, I offer my sincerest thanks to you, Professor Crawford, for making the 5-hour journey to a rather cold Wymondham to speak to us, both this evening and earlier today. What I find most amazing about Professor Crawford is his level of dedication to history. Currently chairing the branch and having previously edited various historical journals and pamphlets is just inspiring. He does all he can to share his knowledge with us here in the chapel tonight and sixth form students earlier in the library. And it has been an absolute pleasure to share in both his enthusiasm and to be able to learn from such an academic. It is a rare occasion when student and teacher alike can experience such a discussion for the sheer enjoyment without the pressure of later having to regurgitate it for exams, something for which I can speak personally. I further want to extend my sincerest gratitude for both the distinguished guests present and, of course, our sponsor, the English Speaking Union, who does all that it can to enhance public speaking and academia within the country. Professor Crawford's lecture has given us much food for thought, and on that note, I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening with dinner in good company.